Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 230 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. One of the absolute miracles of the modern world is our ability to access the entire globe with just the click of a button. Type in an address, and instantly you can see satellite images of everywhere from Tokyo to Reykjavik, including the best ways to get from here to there. In the Middle Ages, people were just as drawn by the idea of imagining and envisioning the whole world and everything in it. With a team of dedicated monks and lay brothers to help him, one 15th-century man attempted to collect it all together to create an incredibly beautiful and detailed map, Fra Mauro. This week, I spoke with Dr. Meredith Small about Fra Mauro's Mappamundi. Meredith is Professor Emerita of the Department of Anthropology at Cornell University, a frequent contributor to public scholarship on anthropological subjects, and the author of several books, including Our Babies, Ourselves, How Biology and Culture Shape the Way We Parent, and Inventing the World, Venice and the Transformation of Western Civilization. Her new book is Here Begins the Dark Sea, Venice, a Medieval Monk, and the Creation of the Most Accurate Map of the World. Our conversation on what makes Fra Mauro's map the most accurate map of the world, what it contained, and how this landed Fra Mauro on the moon is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Meredith, for joining me to talk about this amazing Mappamundi. It is so nice to meet you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, my pleasure. I love talking about this map anytime.
This is your opportunity. So in your book, you talk about this Mappamundi, but you start by talking about maps more broadly. And I think this has to do with your background in anthropology, right? So let's get into this because this is really interesting. Tell us a little bit about humans and maps and how we got into maps, why we're so into maps. Tell us about people and maps.
Well, there's an idea that humans were drawing maps before, of course, there were letters and numbers because they're pictorial, right? And so there are some extremely old maps that are made with a clay tablet. There are some incised on stones in northern Italy. And those kinds of maps, many of them are regional. Like you can tell on those scratched marks, these are the houses, these are the hills, that's what they're indicating. And the point I make in the first chapter of the book, and it is because I'm an anthropologist, that whenever I write a book, I tend to take somewhat of an anthropological view, which I think is both deep in time, meaning evolutionary, which is the big why question. Why do we make maps? And also it's broad in scope across cultures. And with this book, I also go into maps from different cultures that were made before and after it. So that's always my take. In this case, I was really interested in the natural turning to maps that we all do all the time. It's so totally unconscious that we do this. We leave the house. Maybe we know automatically where the bus stop is. You move somewhere. You've got to ask someone, where's the bus stop? And then they tell you, and then it sort of gets imprinted on your brain. And we all know people who have a horrible sense of direction, so we're not going to count them. But we seem to like to see things either on paper or written down, that somehow the artistic value, let's call it that, of diagramming something is better than anything. Now, these days, we're using GPS maps on our phone. Personally, as a new resident in New York City, I still have to ask people because when I get out of the subway, I want to know which way is north, south, east, and west. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to have to walk a block to see the numbers go down or up. I live in Brooklyn. I am completely confused because I haven't got that pinned yet. But when I lived in Philadelphia, it was very easy because the city is a grid and there are two rivers on either side. I tend to orient towards the ocean. So unconsciously, we do this all the time. When someone comes to visit me, I draw them a little map where the croissant shop, the bagel shop, and Starbucks are. I could tell them, go straight, go right, go left. But if I just leave that, I know that someone will look at it and they will exactly know where they're going. Mm-hmm. And I make the point that this must have had evolutionary significance for early humans, that they were crossing the savannas, they were living near water, they were going down rivers, they were walking out of Africa in groups again and again and again. And so they clearly had a sense of geography in that way. And it's so interesting that we have the symbolic ability to write something down, be they letters, numbers, or a map, and understand the meaning of that. That is very particular to humans that we can do that.
Yeah, you were mentioning primates, and primates are slightly different in the way that they do that. You have to teach them how to do that, but people will just pick it up easily, right?
And of course, I have to correct you here because we are primates as well.
Yes, yes.
The professor speaks. And so non-human primates,
Right.
they also make paths through, if they're living in a forest, they make paths, they follow them. Chimpanzees make direct routes to fruiting trees. They keep track of 200 different food resources. And even if they haven't visited in months, they know where to go. So I make the suggestion this is very deeply evolutionary, meaning it's just part of human nature that we do this. And it makes sense. You need to know where you're going and you need to know where to run if somebody or a lion is chasing you. So it has a survival value, knowing where you're going.
Yeah, absolutely. I really relate to your story about moving to a new place and having to find a new way of situating yourself because I live near Toronto and it's always navigating by where is the lake? The lake is to the south. If you know where that is, then you know where you are.
And for your listeners who have been to Venice, and because this is a Venetian map, you'll hear me say many things about Venice. And one of them is it is the most disorienting city in the world that you leave, and God forbid you leave the house without a map. And I know the city really well. I still take a map. And if you saw something you want to buy later, you better buy a little card with that. All the calling cards for stores have maps on the back. My daughter, who's now an adult, when she was 7 and we lived there, she famously said, "You can never get lost in Venice because you always end up at the water." But of course, are you on the north side, the south side, the east or west side of Venice? And the other comment I wanted to make is what is so interesting in thinking about the evolution of the mapping ability is this when humans started really making mappamundi of the world, they were conceiving of something they could not see. They had never seen the earth, really, and they had never, maybe from a mountain, they could look down on their village, but we don't really have a whole idea of what the earth looks like till the astronauts took a picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it, floating in space. So that's why mappamundi in particular are so interesting, because they take the image of the map and turn it into something else, almost like a fantasy of where we live.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go here because when we're talking about evolutionary terms, we're talking about humans, they like to map things, they like to find things, but when we start to actually write maps down, they're not just maps, right? They have agenda. So tell us some of the ways in which we use maps for different purposes other than just navigation.
I think everybody is familiar with, if you were to look at a globe right now, and one that was made, say, in the last 5 years, what we don't realize is that is a political map because it has countries delineated on it. And those country boundaries are often made from air. They're just decided. They aren't mountain barriers or lakes or anything that we have politically imposed this on a globe. And we've done it, fabulous work having to do with mapping things like poverty or places where in the country, in the United States, where you can get an abortion and cross state lines, so that maps have turned into instruments of instruction if you need them. And there's a plethora of maps like that. I mean, you could go into a map store or look on Amazon and see all the different kinds of maps where to have dinner, and those are all plotted out. And one of the interesting things about, let's call it Google Maps, is they do that. They impose upon the geography, both the politics, also the entertainment, the sites, everything is there. We've kind of stacked them all up together. But maps have been used also as, when I say political maps, they can also be propaganda. And certainly in medieval times for Western maps, it was all about Christian propaganda. Mm-hmm. And of course, you don't see that in Islamic maps, which were really designed as art. They're not so geographically correct, but they're incredibly beautiful. And they were made to hang on the walls. These were not maps of navigation. They were maps of information.
Hmm. Yeah, and there are so many different types of maps. I think it's so important to establish that as we get into this, because a map is not just a map. It's all about the person who's creating it and who they're creating it for. So let's get into this. So the map at the heart of your book is a mappamundi, so a world map created by someone named Fra Mauro. So can you give us the time and place that this is created?
Yes. Well, it was finished in 1459 in Venice, and he was a lay monk, meaning he didn't never took the final vows. We don't know much about him. We don't know if his real name was Mauro, which is a very common Italian man's name, but we don't know. But it was common for people to be lay nuns and lay monks. And on the north side of Venice, if you're standing there and you look straight out, you'll see another island, and it's called San Michele, and people know it now as the Cemetery Island. And you go out, especially on the weekends, you'll be traveling with people carrying bouquets, and if you go there, there are lots of people buried there. But originally, in Fra Mauro's time, it was really two islands, Cristoforo and Michele. And then when Napoleon came along and he took away the monastery, put land between those two, made it one island, and made it the Cemetery Island, because the French didn't like the fact that Venetians were buried in the streets of Venice, in like the plazas and stuff. So they were dug up and they were taken out there. So the monastery is still there. The original abbey where he worked, you can go in the courtyard and look around. And then there are newer buildings there as well. And we don't know much about the construction itself, because there were notes, but those are gone. We do have some financial records from the monastery that it'll say X money paid out for this, for the Fra Mauro map. So we know that. And we know that once he was done, it was hung in the monastery for 300 years. And people knew about it. There are copies. Their copy was made for the Medici, for King Alfonso of Portugal. Those are all gone. We don't have them. And so it was known. That's the speculation. We know he had a team of people working with him. This map is 7 feet in diameter. It's gigantic.
Yeah.
And I urge everyone to go see it. If you go to Venice, you have to go into the Cora Museum, which is in Piazza San Marco. It's a civic museum. You'll see a lot of beautiful stuff in this museum. Walk all the way to the end, and now there's a special map exhibit, and there it is. And it is gorgeous. And that's what started me on this book. It wasn't in this special room. This is many years ago. It was hanging in an alcove. And quite frankly, I was looking for the bathroom. And I saw this map and I was like, what is that? And there was just a little sign. And for years, I would go and I would see it. And then during COVID, I thought, I just want to write about one thing. And this is it. And so thank goodness I was able to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an incredible map. And as you lay out through the book, it's revolutionary in lots of different ways. So let's start to get into that. I think perhaps one of the biggest or most recognizable ways that it differs, if you are used to looking at maps, is it orients south instead of north. So tell us a little bit about why that might be.
Yeah, there's speculation about that. We don't really know why, but the second in charge of his team was a navigator, explorer. I think he was also an admiral, Andrea Bianco. And he also had done his own world map. He had gone to the North Sea and back with the Venetian Navy, and he was very well educated in navigation. And his map, which was actually very small and part of a book, was oriented south. So there's some speculation that he was taking the advice of Andrea Bianco. It's also possible that most Islamic maps are oriented to the south. And he surely must have known about those maps from all the sailors who came. But also there's another possibility that when the map was made, it was made sitting on a table, and that maybe there was no real north or south, that it didn't matter because the calligraphers and the artists were walking all the way around it. Mm-hmm. And we just really don't know the answer to that, but it is unusual because it's oriented south for a Western map. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And the other thing that's really noticeable when you're looking at medieval maps is that this one is not centered on Jerusalem, and it doesn't have a lot of those biblical holy sites on it. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So in most maps, as you said, Western Christian maps, Yeah, and you do see a little star with Jerusalem, but it's just not in the center. And he does put Noah's Ark. It's there, but there's no long explanation about these things. And he goes to great pains to follow Marco Polo's descriptions of temples and graveyards and crematoriums in the East. So he really covers other religions while he's doing this. I mean, he was a monk, so clearly this mattered to him, and it was a little chancy in a way. But on the four corners of the map, you get his cosmology, and on the bottom left, he does have the Garden of Eden and the beginning of the world with the four rivers. And it's not that he doesn't, it's not an atheist map, but it's not really like the Hereford map or something that is really pushing the biblical interpretation of the world. He doesn't do that. He is much more focused on the geography. Some people call it the first map that is based more on science and geography than religion. And it appears to be that. When he brings up religious ideas, he often says things on the map like, people have told me this is not true. Mm-hmm. And there is, I'll mention it here, there are over 3,000 inscriptions across this map. They are in not only in Veneziano, which is the language of Venice that's still spoken. I mean, the gondoliers speak, if you listen, they're speaking Veneziano. I can't understand them. I understand Italian, but not them. And so Fra Mauro is explaining things through the whole thing. I chose this because this. Some people told me that. And what's unusual is you get his thought process through all of this. And some of the inscriptions are basically on Post-its, and he's covered up other ones. He's changed his mind over the 9 years. So I wish we knew more what he was thinking. And they're surely in his notes, but they are gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you're looking at the medieval world, you always want to know what they were thinking and almost never can touch it. That's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately.
It is.
Well, what's really interesting about this map itself, and I mean, as you say, there aren't a lot of details that we know about Fra Mauro because that's just the nature of the way that a medieval monastic community is creating things. They're trying to humble themselves and disguise themselves. But he does actually cite a lot of his sources on the map. So what kind of sources is he using to create the map?
Well, some of it is speculation and some of it is on the map. He certainly takes Ptolemy to task. He doesn't agree with him, and he talks about that. And he'll cite someone and say, but I don't think that's true, or other people have told me it's not true. But surely he had access at that time in medieval monasteries. It was pretty simple to borrow books. And because there was no printing press, of course, you were borrowing manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts. And San Michele had a scriptorium, and they taught young boys how to be calligraphers. So he surely had, in private libraries in Venice, Venice was a very literary place. Everybody knew how to read. And he must have been borrowing from those libraries. But I think, my opinion is, that his greatest source really were the sailors who came to Venice. And because Fra Mauro had the job of collecting the rents in Venice on the properties that the monastery owned, he was not a cloistered monk. So he went into Venice. Now, we don't know what he did there. He probably rode himself there. And if he was going to shops, buying inks, whatever, he was interacting with people. Some speculate also that sailors came to him when they found out he was doing this map. They went out to the island to talk to him. And we know about a group of Coptic Ethiopian monks who came to visit him from Ethiopia at one point. And so it's hard for us to project, since we have telephones and everything, how that kind of information gets passed around. I think it's just more slowly. You know, you go to get a sandwich in Venice and everybody around you is talking. And at the same time, he had, of course, Marco Polo, who was Venetian 200 years before. He had the travels of Marco Polo. And interestingly enough, he actually quotes Marco Polo from his book, which wasn't written by Marco Polo, but still. And he never cites Marco Polo. He never says his name. And people have asked me, well, why do you think not? Well, the only thing I can come up with is that Marco Polo was so normal to him, so much part of Venetian life that he just wouldn't bother. And he relied on another Venetian explorer, Niccolo de Conte, who also traveled around a lot, not as much as Marco Polo, but pretty close. So it was such a trading nation, international trade. And part of the things that Fra Mauro does on the map is he shows trade routes. And one of the purposes, as an academic has suggested, is that he's showing how all the trade routes could be linked up and you could get here, there, and everywhere. So again, it's a Venetian map. So it is those Venetian interests that are just part of his belief system, part of his identity, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say that it's one of these things where you have a lot of medieval writers who are not bothering to cite all sorts of people, including the Bible, because they figure everyone already knows what I'm talking about. Like, it's such a familiar quote. I don't even need to tell you who it is. It's like,
I think that's really true. I think it's true. And this map is like an encyclopedia. And when he does quote someone, to me, it's like an academic writing and giving the references. When he does say this, so and so said this here, but I don't believe that.
Yeah, you do want to show your scholarly credentials. Like, I've actually done my research before I do this, but also everybody knows Marco Polo. So let's just take him at face value because we've been thinking about this for 200 years and it seems to make sense.
Yeah.
So what are some other clues that make you think that he was speaking to sailors about this? Because it's not just that there are trade routes on it, but you also see pictures on it. Do you think that those were informed by other sailors as well?
Sure. You see across the map, one of the really fun features are the waves that are drawn and then all the different kinds of boats. So there are dhows, there are Chinese junks, and he's putting them all over the world. So he knows, he's seen in Venice all these boats come into port. And he also, one of my favorite quotes is about some sort of tornado that will drag you under the sea. And he'll say, sailors have told me this, but I don't think it's true, because they weren't dragged under it. They don't know. And there are also some mysterious things on the map, like a row of islands in the Indian Ocean. And we don't know why he put them like that because they're not like that in real life. Like, why is it like that? But I think also that that's sort of a standard talking point for Venice at that time, that it was it still is a cosmopolitan city from people all over the world. And when you look at paintings that are that old, people dressed in all different kinds of outfits that come from all over the world. And I think it's hard for us now. We have to think of a port almost like New York, where you have so many different, or Amsterdam, Rotterdam, where you have so many different kinds of people coming. And in Venice, since it was all about trade, people came, brought their goods from the Silk Roads, wherever. The Silk Road ends at water, and then you have to port those things from the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, into the Adriatic and to Venice. And when people did this, of course, it took a very long time. It's not like today you land, you get over jet lag, and you leave. People came and they stayed for a long time. And those boats were unloading things and loading up other trade goods to take them somewhere else. And so it really was a hub of that kind of interaction.
Yeah. And I was thinking as you're talking that it's just as likely that many of the monks who landed in Venice might have just stayed. They might have been sailors and decided they wanted to be monks and they're already there and the weather's pretty good. So he could have had sailors
Absolutely.
who were monks in the community as well to talk to.
Absolutely. He could have had monks who were Venetian, grew up, became sailors, and then came back home and joined the monastery. Absolutely. That could have happened.
Yeah. And I love this idea that this is coming together as discussion, not only through books, but through people who are alive and sitting down and having, well, not tea, but having a drink and talking about this and creating this. Because as you say, no one has seen the entire world themselves. And so it's a collection of human knowledge and activity that creates this, which makes it so beautiful.
I mean, in 1459, they didn't know there were giant continents on the other side of the earth. You think about it, and everything. This is right on the cusp, sort of between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and calling it the first quote unquote scientific map. I think of it as like a flexion point of going into paying more attention to the geography. And after this, we have the age of exploration and discovery. And that, of course, was based on not an interest in what the world looked like, but commercialism. Mm-hmm. They were going off to find resources and bring them back home. And that was right after this map that started happening.
Yeah, I really want to come back to commercialism in a second, but I do want to come back to geography for one moment, because there is a point at which he mentions on the map, some of the things I've shrunk and some of the things I've made bigger. This is just because I think the map works better like this. So can you tell us some of the ways he's tweaked the map to be more functional for him and the people looking at it?
Well, that begs the question about his drawing of Africa, I think, more than anywhere. And if you look at the map, it is the first map that definitively shows you can sail or row around South Africa. And so that opens up a trade route doing that. But if you look at Africa itself, the Gulf of Guinea is gigantic because the Portuguese had only gone so far. They'd only gone to the mouth of the Gulf of Guinea, and he didn't know how deeply it went. And so he's guessing in there, and he's basing it. Westerners used to call Africa Ethiopia. So he's basing it on what these monks from Ethiopia told them. And he even says that. But the geography of Africa is not particularly accurate. It is on the top half, but not the bottom half, because Westerners hadn't gotten there yet. And if you look around India and Asia, that's a little more accurate because there had been so much travel by Westerners and communication among those cultures. And so it's better. His Europe is pretty straight on, as is the area around the North Sea, Scandinavia and stuff like that. And of course, it's out of whack because it's not a globe. And whenever you try to flatten a map, it changes things. And so I, too, found that inscription really funny where he says, I did this, I did that. And modern map makers will say that, too. Map makers will say that. If I do this, I realize that that's going to make South America really long. But it's always that problem of projection, which I didn't really understand till I wrote this book.
Yeah, flattening out that earth. Like I remember
orange peel. Yeah.
trying to make that work in elementary school. It's just not very neat. And it's funny because Africa is famously out of proportion on globes because it's a much bigger continent than people imagine right. From looking at a globe, because people are trying to fit it on the ball and make it work.
I've spent a lot of time in Australia and have really good Australian friends. And I was in Venice with one of them. We're looking at the map and the world map. And I looked at him and I said, I bet you'd like a map world with Australia in the center. And he went, yeah. Because if we looked at the globe and we were Australian, that would be the center.
Yeah.
Instead of how when we in America look at a globe, we look at North America. But we are not the center of the earth. We are not. And so again, it gets back to that idea of it being political and what's important,
Yeah, it's funny because if it's a ball, you can roll it however you want and change the perspective. But if you put Australia in the middle, it would really be disorienting for everyone outside of Australia, I think.
But if we put Canada, was just like, down a couple of inches. And then, South America was like way under, right? It's just a ball, it's a ball.
There's a lot of tundra you'd be seeing if you turned it that way. But Fra Mauro does say, I know if you look at this map, Asia looks huge, but really Asia is huge, guys. We really need to pay attention to that. And I think that's an interesting little note as well, is he's recognizing that Europeans might imagine that Europe is the be all and end all. It's the center of the ball when you turn it. But he's saying Asia actually is much bigger than you might think.
And he's believing Marco Polo there, who traveled for 20 something years in Asia. And when you look at the map, his northern Asia is a little more sketchy because Marco Polo didn't go that high. But the parts where Marco Polo went are very accurate. When I was in Venice a couple of years ago, there was a seminar held at the museum, and it was a group of academics who had used Google Maps on this map and pinpointed things. And they were working with a group of students from Singapore, and some of them understood Chinese. And some of the names that Marco Polo used, they understood them where other people haven't. And they would say, that's accurate. That is where that city is. Even now, Marco Polo was right back then. He wrote it down. There's no map of Marco Polo's. He was supposed to draw one in the Palazzo Ducale. It got covered up or something like that. And isn't that interesting? And when you look at the map, Europe is very small. But what I do in every world map and what I do with people when I'm showing this, I go find the boot of Italy. Once you find the boot of Italy, then you can orient the whole map for a Westerner. And it's the geographic feature that stands out the most. And it's tiny on this map. That's the other thing. He didn't make the Italian peninsula gigantic. He made it true to size. And that wasn't always appreciated.
Yeah, I can imagine it wouldn't be. When a map is also art, you might imagine you'd want to inflate that boot and make it more important.
Sure. Or, if your family was from a particular area on that boot, you kind of make that bigger. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's circle around back to commercialism. What kind of stuff do you find on this map? What is it a map to?
What's interesting is that he draws or talks about both natural resources and also things humans have made, like cloth, or indigo paint or something like that. And the inscriptions, thank goodness, have been translated into English, because otherwise I couldn't have written this book. And yes, I read all 3,000 of them. And I was able to put them into categories like resources, da 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 da. But he also talks about gems, gold, silver, and birds and horses, and not necessarily things that you might want to take back. He does talk about spices, but that was pretty well known. But things that cultures have to offer, but also what they do for a living. These people are farmers, these people fish, and there's some fantastical stuff on there. Like, it's been said that if you put this in this water, it'll turn to gold. So there's still mythology on it, parts of it. But the resources, I think, are about him saying these countries, these continents have incredible worth if we want to think commercially. And if you can sail around the bottom of Africa, you can do this much faster than using the Silk Roads and then having to ship things home. It totally opened up or pushed forward international trade. And just by writing, I think it's surprising that he writes gold here, rubies there, there's said to be diamonds here. Kind of makes you want to go over there and dig.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if having these things paired up is some form of a way to show you where to find rubies or something like that. But also, I wonder if it's a way to sort of twig people to, oh, that's where that is. I've heard of that before. That's where the rubies came from. So maybe it's a way to both orient in terms of what the city is, but also where to find the things that you want.
Yeah, it could be. That would be for merchants. That's not going to be for your average citizen, because they're not getting on a boat. Certainly, if you were especially looking for gold and silver, something like that, you would think, oh, I think I'll go there. It's hard to say how many people actually got to look at this map during its lifetime. It was known about, but it's not like, if it had been printed in a book and disseminated, it would have gotten bigger coverage. I mean, just for the fact that I'm the first person to actually write there are 2 academic books. There's one fantasy novel, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And what a surprise. And this map is considered a treasure of Venice. Mm-hmm. It's only left Venice once in 500 years. It went to Australia, to the National Library of Australia in Canberra. And I urge people to look at on YouTube of the videos of the National Library and the transport, the shipping of this map. It really gives you an idea how big it is.
And it's something that a Venetian would appreciate. I think how you ship something like this. How do you get it there on that boat?
They want to row it over there themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's one more little fact nugget that I want to mention before we move to the modern part of it that you and I were talking about just before we started recording. And that is that this map seems to be the first European map to show Japan, right?
Right.
That's really interesting,
isn't it? Isn't it? And also, geographers have said his map of Russia is really quite good, like the coastline and everything. But yeah, the first map to really show Japan. Question is, who told him about that? Mm-hmm. I don't think Marco Polo ever went to Japan. So where did he get that?
No, I don't think he mentions it. And it's not as if Japan was unknown to the entire coast of
That's right.
China, you
That's
know?
right. Absolutely. And I think that's one reason there are not so many Asian world maps. There are a couple because it was already accepted what China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, these were well known. It's just as Westerners, they're not well known to us,
Hmm.
but everybody else knew them well. I mean, Arabic sailors were all over that place and
Hmm.
they know the routes to China and back. And Westerners only had one route up to China and back down, but that whole area of the world was heavily traded among the people who lived there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge world of trade that's happening, and you do need to just get people together to chat about it if you're going to collect it together to make a world map. And Venice is the place to do that.
That's right. That's right.
So, Fra Mauro does have an interesting connection that is not of this earth. So, can you tell us how he's actually managed to get himself into space?
Yes. Well, I forget the year, but the National Astronomy Union, whatever it's called, named an area of the moon, and this is a very long time ago, the Fra Mauro Formation. And it also includes the Fra Mauro Highlands. So it's basically a crater, part of a crater. And they did that before anybody in modern day paid attention to this map. And that's where, when Apollo 14 landed and Alan Shepard played golf, he did that on the Fra Mauro Formation. And so that's the connection. And also, we only see the first globe when Andrews took a picture of an Earthrise. They were orbiting, Apollo 8 was orbiting the moon. They didn't land on it. But on Christmas Eve, there was an Earthrise, and he could see the globe of the Earth suspended in space. And he took a picture. And it's like the most iconic picture we have of our home. That's it. But the imagination of humanity for all these hundreds and thousands of years of getting this, once they got the Earth wasn't flat, that it was round, there was the idea we should be able to sail one way and come back. We should be able to do that. Too bad there was all that land in the middle. Known as the Americas, yes.
Just kind of tripped on it on the way to China. Yeah, it's true. I mean, people figured out the Earth was not flat many thousands of years ago, and they've been trying to conceptualize it ever since. And this map
and they
is
had
beautiful.
real problems with the poles. You often see the South Pole is called Terra Incognita. They thought something was down there. There was the idea there must be a north and a south to balance the globe so it wouldn't spin out of control.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to imagine the unknown, but now we have Landsat satellites as we speak, taking photographs of the Earth going all the way around. And one of the photos that's in my book is a comparison. The Landsat people put together Fra Mauro's map, put it in his orientation the way it is now on Earth, and then have a picture of the map. And you see how much he got right. Not everything, but he got it right. Yeah.
It's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, we think that we're so advanced, but if you just dropped us in Venice in the 1400s and said, draw the world, could we do much better? I don't know.
That's I thought you were going to say, drop us in Venice, try to find your way home. But that's absolutely it. I think that's a great way to put it. If you were dropped in Venice, could you draw a map of the world? Even now, I'm not sure I could do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I just love that it is this compilation of all the knowledge that Fra Mauro could possibly gather together and put a map that's taken 9 years to create. And yeah, it is a treasure. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast to tell us about it.
Yes, I encourage everybody to go see the map. Yes.
To find out more about Meredith's work, you can visit her website at meredithfsmall.com. Her new book is Here Begins the Dark Sea: Venice, a Medieval Monk, and the Creation of the Most Accurate Map of the World. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, one thing that I really enjoy on the website is doing this list of 10 open access articles that have been published in the previous month. My librarian in me loves to kind of search around for this stuff. And, I think it's a cool way of seeing what's going on in the world of medieval studies. So I just finished the month of January. Some cool stuff. Like there's a piece on Norse-Sami relations in northern Scandinavia. There's a piece about a shipwreck in the Baltic and what they could learn about the bricks that were on the ship. And also a piece on reevaluating the life of the Irish Saint Bridget of Kildare. She's a famous figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I also have been doing for the last couple months an expanded version on our Patreon where I list all the articles, open access articles I can find from the previous month. And I found over 50 actually for this month.
Amazing. So anyone who's a patron can access all of these open access articles?
You have to have a certain tier, but basically if you're willing to give up a few dollars a month, yeah, that's one of the things you can access. We've been building up our Patreon quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's win-win. You get to support your favorite podcasters. I mean, me, but also Michael Livingston and Kelly DeFries and the other people who are podcasting for medievalist.net, plus the writers at medievalist.net. And you get open access articles without having to do the legwork of finding them.
You can even join for free onto the Patreon. And one new thing that we've been adding is more ebooks. Patreon allows us to sell digital versions of books. So we put up the EPUB or PDF, in some cases both. We've been doing it with Witten Publishing and now Arc Humanities. We've been doing one of their series of books, and I love adding it on, and I love seeing those sales.
Yeah, well, a guy's got to eat, right? We all have to eat. But I used to be somebody who worked for Arc Humanities Press, and I know the amazing work that goes into those books. So it's awesome that they are more widely available by having them on Patreon, because they can be hard to find sometimes. So it's awesome that people can download them digitally from Patreon. So patreon.com/medievalist is where it's at.
It is where it's at. Yes.
Okay. You got more articles on medievalist.net.
Yeah, we have a piece also on 5 warrior bishops from the Middle Ages.
Nice.
So that's always cool to look at. And an article about the DNA of chess pieces from a medieval chess set that was discovered in Poland.
Amazing.
So they drilled into their little bottoms, found out what they were made of.
Ooh, and it will all be revealed on medievalist.net.
Indeed, indeed.
Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and giving us all of these new articles to dig into. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of amazing goodies like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. And the list just keeps on growing. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from maps to caps, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.